I still remember the exact second I saw the murky streaks spreading across the water, unnatural swirls of chemical green and gray that didn't belong in my lake, the lake I had inherited from my grandfather, the lake that had been in my family for 3 generations, and the lake that, as far as I was concerned, was my personal sanctuary from the chaos of life. Yet there I stood on the shoreline at dawn, fishing rod in hand, staring at the oily shimmer that was spreading like a disease across the surface, and I knew instantly that this wasn't an accident. No storm runoff, no natural bloom, no innocent explanation. This was sabotage, deliberate, calculated, and I felt my chest tighten with a fury that burned hotter than the rising sun. Because only one group of people had both the motive and the audacity to try something like this. The HOA, that smug little band of self-important tyrants who had been harassing me ever since I moved back into my family's property after my father passed away, thinking they could bully me into compliance the way they did with everyone else. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't comprehend, was that I wasn't like their other victims. I wasn't going to bend, break, or run, and if they wanted war, they had just declared it in the most unforgivable way possible, because you don't poison a man's lake and walk away unscathed, not when that lake is his lifeblood, his heritage, and his peace of mind. For months before this moment, the HOA had been circling me like vultures, sending violation notices about my old wooden dock, claiming it wasn't up to code, demanding I tear it down and replace it with some approved design that matched their sterile suburban aesthetic, then coming after me for the tiny boathouse my grandfather built in the 70s, calling it an unapproved structure, even though it had stood longer than half the houses in their development. And when those tactics didn't work, when I refused to sign their bogus compliance forms or pay their ridiculous fines, they escalated, sending their so-called community officers to harass me at all hours, standing at the edge of my property, snapping photos like wannabe paparazzi, even threatening to tow my truck because I parked it on my own gravel driveway, as if my land suddenly belonged to them just because their cookie-cutter neighborhood sprouted up around me in the last decade. But none of those stunts broke me, and that infuriated them. So they went after the one thing they thought would cut deepest: my lake, my fishing, the one tradition that kept me grounded in the memory of my father and grandfather, and seeing those chemicals spread like cancer across the water, watching the fish I had cared for float belly up within hours, I swore right then and there that this wasn't just going to be a fight over violations or property lines anymore. This was war, and I was going to make sure the HOA regretted the day they ever crossed me. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have realized, was that their very own water supply, every single glass they drank, every shower they took, every lawn sprinkler they ran to keep their perfect green grass alive, depended on this lake because it fed the underground reservoir the county tapped into for the neighborhood, and by poisoning it to spite me, they hadn't just attacked me, they had doomed themselves. But I wasn't about to tell them that yet. No, I was going to watch them choke on their own arrogance, let them dig their hole deeper, and when the moment was right, I'd pull the rug out from under them in a way so devastating they'd never recover. For now, though, I had to play it smart, gather proof, and bide my time, because the HOA was crafty, always covering their tracks, hiding behind paperwork and committees, acting like they were untouchable, but everyone makes mistakes when they get too confident, and I was counting on their greed and pettiness to blind them to the storm that was about to hit. That morning, instead of fishing, I walked the shoreline with my phone, filming everything: the rainbow sheen of chemicals on the water, the dead base floating near the reeds, the strange metallic smell that clung to the air, and I narrated. Every second, calling out dates, times, descriptions, because evidence was my weapon now, and I wasn't going to let them slither away from accountability the way they had so many times before. I sent a sample of the water to a private lab, paying out of pocket to make sure it couldn't be brushed aside by the HOA's buddies on the county board, and while I waited for the results, I started digging into the HOA's finances, pulling, public records, attending meetings undercover, listening to the smug way they laughed about teaching lessons to homeowners who didn't fall in line, and every shred of arrogance I uncovered only fueled the fire in my chest. At night, I sat on my porch staring out at the lake, listening to the silence where frogs and crickets should have been singing. And I thought about my grandfather, about how he used to tell me that water is life, that as long as we protected the lake, it would always take care of us, and I felt like I had failed him by letting these parasites touch it. But then I reminded myself that this wasn't over, that the HOA had only just made their first move, and mine was coming, sharp, precise, and final. The first glass of brown-tinged water pouring out of a neighbor's kitchen tap was the moment I knew the HOA's clock had started ticking, because when Mrs. Kendall, one of the board's most loyal lapdogs, stormed into the grocery store, waving a bottle of foul-smelling tap water in front of anyone who would listen, crying about how her children had rashes from their showers, I didn't feel sympathy. I felt satisfaction, because this was the inevitable consequence of their arrogance, the fallout from their attempt to poison me into submission. And as word spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, panic started to ripple across their pristine streets like cracks splitting through glass. And I sat on my porch watching it all unfold, calm, patient, like a fisherman waiting for his line to tighten. But here's the thing. I wasn't content to just sit back and let fate punish them. I wanted them to know that the very man they tried to break was the one holding the knife over their fragile empire. And so I started moving quietly, planting seeds, showing up at county meetings with printouts of water quality reports, whispering in the ears of journalists I knew from my father's days on the town council, carefully timing my leaks so the story built momentum like a slow-moving avalanche, and every time the HOA tried to dismiss the complaints as isolated. Plumbing issues. Another dozen residents reported the same foul taste, the same headaches, the same skin burns from their showers, until denial was no longer an option, and fear was the only thing they had left. Still, the board didn't know I had evidence, real, undeniable proof, because the lab results I received 2 days later showed a toxic cocktail of herbicides, pesticides, and industrial chemicals dumped into the lake in concentrations that were no accident, no runoff, but an intentional poisoning designed to wipe out aquatic life. And there were traces of a brand new chemical compound manufactured by a supplier that just so happened to have signed a contract with the HOA for groundskeeping, which tied them directly to the crime. And when I held those results in my hand, I knew I had them cornered. But I also knew revealing it too soon would just give them time to rally their lawyers and muddy the waters. So instead, I chose a different tactic. I was going to turn their own community against them before they even realized I was pulling the strings. I started with the families, the parents terrified for their children, quietly telling them that the lake wasn't just poisoned, but that the poison was creeping into their faucets, their hoses, their baby bottles, and I didn't have to exaggerate, because it was the truth. And the truth is always more powerful than lies when people are desperate. And desperate they were, because by the end of the week, the entire neighborhood reeked of chlorine and decay as the HOA scrambled to cover up the spreading contamination by overflushing the lines, but all they did was make it worse, stirring the toxins deeper into the system. At night, I drove around the neighborhood, unseen in my truck with the lights off, watching residents gather in driveways, whispering about lawsuits, about betrayal, about resigning from the HOA altogether. And though they didn't know it yet, every ounce of their anger was directed at the very people who had caused this mess in the first place. The board, the president, the smug cowards who thought they could poison a man's legacy and get away with it. Then came the emergency HOA meeting, packed to the walls with furious homeowners, and though I didn't speak a word, I was there, standing quietly in the back, watching the panic in the president's eyes as neighbor after neighbor demanded answers, waving bottles of brown water, photos of dead pets, hospital bills for children with mysterious rashes, and the once mighty board suddenly looked like cornered rats scrambling for excuses. That's when I knew it was time to strike. Not with lawyers or police, not yet, but with something far more devastating. Exposure. The next morning, I uploaded my footage, the video I had shot on the shoreline the morning of the poisoning, showing the chemicals staining the lake, the fish floating lifelessly, my voice narrating with cold precision as I explained that the HOA had waged war on me by trying to destroy my property, and in doing so, they had poisoned their own water supply, and then I posted the lab results alongside it, naming the supplier they contracted, linking every piece of evidence together in a web so tight it couldn't be unraveled, and within hours the video went viral, not just in the neighborhood, not just in the county, but across the state, as environmental watchdogs, lawyers, and media outlets latched onto the scandal like sharks to blood, and suddenly the HOA wasn't just dealing with angry homeowners, they were facing state regulators, lawsuits, and the wrath of every parent who realized their children had been drinking from a poisoned tap. But even as the walls closed in on them, even as the news vans parked outside their manicured subdivision, the board still hadn't realized that this wasn't just about revenge for me. It was about legacy, about sending a message so loud and clear that no HOA, no petty tyrant, would ever dare to touch what was mine again. And so I sat back, watching the chaos I had unleashed, knowing this was only the beginning, because what was about to come next would make their current nightmare look like a pleasant dream. The night the HOA president's $1 million lawn sprinklers sputtered out and started spewing foul black sludge instead of water was the night their empire began to truly collapse, because if there's one thing a neighborhood built on appearances can't survive, it's the slow, ugly unraveling of their perfect image, and as I watched from the shadows while her carefully manicured roses withered in hours, I felt the first taste of justice settling sweet on my tongue. But I knew the real reckoning hadn't even started yet, because what none of them realized was that their HOA's survival wasn't tied to their rules, their fines, or their lawyers. It was tied directly to the poisoned veins of the lake that they themselves had tried to kill. And every day that passed was another day the toxins seeped deeper into their lives, another day the panic spread like fire through dry grass. By now, the media was swarming the subdivision, vans lined up along the entrance, reporters sticking microphones into car windows as terrified families packed up and fled, and the board, once smug and untouchable, was now besieged, their emails hacked and leaked, their bank records subpoenaed, their late-night emergency meetings caught on hidden recordings that I made sure found their way into the right hands. And the picture that emerged was devastating. Not only had they authorized the chemical dumping, but they had diverted HOA funds to pay for it under the guise of pest control and aquatic maintenance. A paper trail so sloppy it was practically a confession, and the residents who once cheered them now spit their names like curses. Yet even as they burned, I wasn't satisfied. Because revenge isn't just about exposing the crime. It's about making the guilty feel every ounce of fear, helplessness, and humiliation they tried to inflict on you, and so I decided to push harder, to twist the knife. I started mailing anonymous packages to each board member, thick envelopes filled with photos I'd taken of their poisoned lake at sunrise, close-ups of dead fish, screenshots of their own signatures on the contracts, tied to the chemical supplier, and a single note written in bold letters. This is your legacy. Some tried to deny it, some threatened me publicly, but behind closed doors they were crumbling. One board member resigned in tears, another was caught fleeing town in the middle of the night, abandoning his house to foreclosure, and the president, herself, the iron-fisted queen who had signed more violation notices against me than I could count, started showing up with bodyguards at community meetings, terrified of her own neighbors. Still, I wasn't done, because the greatest blow was yet to come. And it wasn't going to come from me alone. It was going to come from the very residents they had betrayed. I began organizing them quietly, meeting small groups at diners, porches, anywhere outside the watchful eyes of the board. And I told them the truth, that they had the power to dissolve the HOA entirely, to strip the board of its authority, to reclaim their homes and their voices, and the idea spread like wildfire, a rebellion born from desperation and fueled by rage, and soon whispers of dissolution became shouts, petitions, and marches right through the pristine streets they once feared to scuff with their shoes. The board tried to fight back, issuing threats, hiring lawyers, even calling the police on their own residents. But the officers had seen the same poisoned water reports as everyone else, and they weren't about to protect the very people responsible for poisoning children. The turning point came when the county health department officially condemned the neighborhood's water supply, declaring every home unsafe until further notice, and the HOA had no funds left to fix it, no plan, no allies, just a mob of furious families demanding their heads. And as I stood on the edge of my property, watching the once proud HOA crumble under the weight of its own corruption, I knew I had achieved something greater than revenge. I had started a revolution that would leave scars so deep the land itself would remember. And yet a part of me still burned, because the lake, my lake, was still poisoned, still silent, and I couldn't rest until I restored it to the living heart it once was, which meant there was still one final act to play. One last trap to spring, and when it came, it would wipe away the last remnants of their arrogance forever. The night the county sheriff's deputies rolled up to the HOA president's mansion with flashing lights and a warrant in hand was the night the mask finally ripped off, because for years she had strutted around untouchable, barking orders, weaponizing fines, threatening families, and poisoning my lake without blinking. But when those deputies marched her out in handcuffs, her pearls rattling against her neck as she screamed about conspiracies, I knew the tide had turned for good. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't even imagine, was that her arrest wasn't the climax of this war. It was only the opening act of the next chapter, because her downfall didn't restore my lake, didn't heal the poisoned water, didn't bring back the life that once thrived beneath its surface. And until that wound was healed, I wasn't stopping. The arrest triggered a domino effect. Lawsuits rained down like hail, state investigators swarmed the neighborhood, the HOA bank accounts were frozen, and homeowners who once bowed to her now circled like wolves, demanding refunds, demanding justice, demanding blood. But chaos has a way of breeding new monsters, and in the power vacuum left by her arrest, whispers began to circulate of a shadow faction within the HOA, board members and wealthy homeowners who had quietly profited from the poisoning through backroom deals with the chemical supplier, who weren't about to let their empire fall. Without a fight, and as I sifted through leaked emails and hacked documents sent to me by anonymous allies, I realized the rabbit hole went deeper than I'd imagined. The poisoning wasn't just about me, wasn't just a petty move to drive me from my land. It was part of a larger scheme, a plan to buy up parcels of lakeside property cheap once the contamination drove owners out, then sell the cleaned-up land to developers for millions. And my family's property was the crown jewel at the center of it all, the last untouched shoreline, the one piece they couldn't get their claws on, which made me their ultimate enemy. And if I thought they were dangerous before, now they were cornered, desperate, and far more ruthless. One night, as I sat on my porch with a shotgun across my lap, watching the moonlight ripple on the still sick lake, I caught the faint glow of headlights where no car should be, creeping slowly along the service road that skirted the far edge of my land, and my gut told me this wasn't a neighbor, wasn't a lost driver, this was them. The shadow faction making their next move, and sure enough, minutes later I heard the crunch of footsteps in the brush, the low murmur of voices, and then the sharp hiss of something being poured into the soil near my waterline. They were back, doubling down on the poisoning, trying to finish what they started, but this time I was ready. I slipped into the darkness, camera rolling in one hand, shotgun steady in the other, and I filmed every second. Their faces, their license plate, the barrels of chemicals they dragged out of a van marked as lawn care. And I made sure they saw me, made sure they knew the man they tried to destroy was still standing, unbroken, and now armed with proof that could end them forever. They scattered like cockroaches, scrambling into the night. But I already had what I needed, and by the time dawn broke, their images were plastered across every news outlet, every social feed, every corner of the community, and the narrative shifted from scandal to conspiracy, from local outrage to a statewide investigation into corruption, fraud, and environmental terrorism. Yet even as the walls closed tighter, I could feel the storm brewing bigger than ever, because cornered animals don't just roll over, they bite. And deep down I knew the HOA's most dangerous players hadn't shown their true teeth yet, that the fight for my lake, my land, and my legacy was only entering its darkest, bloodiest stage. The first bullet shattered my front porch railing before I even heard the crack of the rifle, and in that split second, as splinters flew past my face, I knew the HOA's shadow faction had finally decided to stop playing games and start a war of blood, because lawsuits, scandals, and arrests hadn't broken me, and desperate men with fortunes on the line don't retreat. They escalate, and escalate they did, turning my quiet lakeside sanctuary into a battlefield where every shadow might hide. An enemy, and every night was a test of survival. But fear wasn't new to me, and if they thought gunfire would scare me off the land my grandfather built with his bare hands, they had no idea who they were dealing with. I dove behind the stone fire pit he'd laid decades ago, heart pounding but mind razor sharp, counting the seconds between the shots, tracing the direction of the muzzle flash across the water, and I realized they weren't amateurs. These weren't drunken neighbors with a grudge. This was coordinated, professional. A hit meant to silence me before I could drag more of their secrets into the light, and it only confirmed what I already suspected. The poisoning, the corruption, the land grab, it all tied back to something bigger than suburban politics. Something with money, muscle, and reach. And I was the thorn they couldn't pull out. When the gunfire ceased, when their van peeled off into the night, I didn't call the sheriff. I'd learned not to trust local law long ago, not when so many of them owed favors to the same developers and businessmen lurking behind this HOA scheme. Instead, I called in an old friend, a former Marine sniper I'd served alongside back in my younger years. A man who owed me his life and never forgot a debt. And within 24 hours, he was sitting at my kitchen table with a rifle, case longer than the counter, grinning like Christmas morning as I explained what we were up against. We set up surveillance along the lake, motion-activated cameras, thermal drones, tripwire alarms hidden in the brush, because if they wanted a war, I was going to give them one. And unlike them, I wasn't hiding behind committees and bylaws. I was fighting for blood, for family, for legacy, and that kind of fight doesn't end until one side is erased. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was imploding. Families were fleeing in droves, houses abandoned with foreclosure notices slapped on the doors, and those who stayed were too terrified to speak above whispers, because the story had shifted from poisoned water to armed violence, from corruption to survival. And every whisper carried my name. Some calling me the resistance, others calling me the cause. But either way, I was the center of the storm, and I accepted it. Because that's what they made me. Then came the fire. One night, flames tore through the HOA clubhouse, the smug little building where they once held their meetings and schemed their petty schemes, now reduced to ash and cinders. And though I had nothing to do with it, they blamed me instantly, plastering my name across anonymous threats, spray-painting murderer on my fence, trying to paint me as the villain. But what they didn't know was that I'd planted cameras around their own clubhouse weeks earlier. And the footage I released showed their own men hauling in fuel cans, lighting the blaze in some insane insurance scam to fund their fight. And when that footage hit the news, whatever shred of credibility the HOA had left burned with it. But even cornered, they weren't done, And I learned just how deep this rot went when I intercepted an email chain linking their chemical supplier directly to a developer whose name carried weight far beyond our county, a man with ties to state senators, construction moguls, and even organized crime. And in that moment, I understood why they'd risk so much, why they'd tried to erase me by poison, by scandal, by bullets, because I wasn't just standing in the way of a lakefront development deal. I was standing in the way of a billion-dollar empire, and the kind of men who dream of empires don't quit until their enemies are buried. The realization didn't scare me. It hardened me, because it meant my fight wasn't just about a lake anymore. It was about exposing an entire machine of greed, corruption, and violence. And if I was going to bring it down, I had to hit harder. Strike deeper and drag every one of them into the light where they couldn't hide. And so, with my Marine ally by my side, with footage, documents, and the raw fury of a man with nothing left to lose, I began planning the next strike, knowing the HOA's shadow faction wouldn't wait long to make theirs. And the question wasn't if they'd come for me again, it was how many bodies they'd leave behind when they did. The first time I saw his face plastered across a glossy magazine cover in the waiting room of a county office, I understood just how far this war reached, because the man smiling on that cover wasn't just some faceless developer. He was Victor Langston, billionaire real estate mogul, state kingmaker, and a man whose fingerprints were smeared across half the construction deals in the region. And when I cross-referenced the leaked contracts I'd intercepted from the HOA with his subsidiaries, the puzzle finally locked into place. The poisoning of my lake wasn't some isolated act of spite. It was the opening move of Langston's empire, a deliberate attempt to clear out the old, poison the land, and rebuild the shoreline into luxury resorts and golf courses worth billions. And I had been standing in the way of it all, a lone man, stubbornly refusing to give up his ancestral land, a splinter in the paw of a giant who didn't take kindly to resistance. Suddenly, everything made sense. The chemical supplier was one of his shell companies, the HOA board members had been puppets on his payroll, and the shadow faction still operating in the neighborhood was nothing more than his foot soldiers, too scared of him to back down even as their world crumbled. And that realization chilled me more than any bullet or threat, because fighting a board of suburban tyrants was one thing, but fighting a billionaire with ties to senators, mobsters, and private security firms was another beast entirely. Still, fear has never been enough to make me bow. And if Langston thought money and influence made him untouchable, he was about to learn that there are still places where truth, fury, and legacy hit harder than cash, and I was going to drag him and his empire down into the mud of his own making. My first move was simple: exposure. I compiled every scrap of evidence I had, footage of the men dumping chemicals, documents tracing the contracts back to his shell companies, the timeline of poisoning, the HOA's fraudulent bookkeeping, the arson of their own clubhouse, and I packaged it into a dossier so airtight it could choke a courtroom, then sent it anonymously to investigative journalists with national reach, people who weren't in Langston's pocket and who smelled blood in the water the moment they saw. The words environmental terrorism tied to his empire. Within a week, headlines exploded. Billionaire developer linked to HOA poisoning scandal, luxury moguls' ties to neighborhood terror, state senators under fire for Langston donations, and for the first time, the giant flinched. But exposure comes with consequences, and Langston didn't get to where he was by playing clean. 2 nights after the first wave of stories broke, I came home to find my front gate smashed, my Marine friend unconscious on the porch with a warning carved into the wood beside him: leave or die. That was when I knew we weren't dealing with lawyers anymore. We were dealing with enforcers, men who didn't carry briefcases but carried knives and guns, and if I didn't adapt, I'd end up floating in the same poisoned water they tried to use against me. So I fortified the property further: motion sensors, underground caches, backup generators, and I began gathering allies, not just angry neighbors this time, but activists, environmental watchdog groups, even ex-law enforcement officers sick, of Langston's stranglehold on the county. And slowly but surely, the fight was no longer mine alone. It was a movement, and that terrified him more than any rifle in my hand. He tried to paint me as a terrorist, feeding the press stories about a radical lakeside landowner staging violence against innocent homeowners. But the footage, the evidence, the dead fish, the poisoned water, the burned clubhouse, all of it screamed louder than his propaganda, and public opinion turned against him faster than even I expected. Yet cornered titans don't fall quietly, and I knew the next move he made would be brutal, desperate, and aimed not just at me, but at anyone who dared to stand with me. And sure enough, whispers began to reach my ears. Activists receiving death. Threats. Journalists tailed by black SUVs. County officials suddenly retiring after taking bribes, and all of it pointed to a storm building on the horizon. The lake, my lake, sat silent in the middle of it all, a mirror reflecting the corruption, greed, and violence of men who thought they could own nature. And as I stood on its shore, shotgun in hand, allies at my back, I swore to my grandfathers' memory that I wouldn't let this end with compromise or settlement. This war was going to end with Victor Langston broken, exposed, and ruined, no matter how deep I had to wade into the darkness to drag him there. The night the black SUVs rolled up my gravel road with their headlights killed and their engines growling low like predators in the dark, I knew the war had finally come home, because Victor Langston's enforcers weren't here to intimidate anymore. They were here to erase me, to silence the man who had turned their billion-dollar scheme into a public scandal. And as I crouched low in the shadows of my porch, finger tight on the trigger of my grandfather's old pump-action, I felt the weight of generations on my shoulders, the blood and sweat that built this land, this lake, and I swore then and there that if they wanted to take it from me, they'd have to wade through fire and blood to do it. They moved like professionals, fanning out, night vision goggles glinting faintly as they swept toward the waterline, weapons drawn, barrels of something strapped to their backs, more poison, more chemicals, their final attempt to kill the lake. For good before finishing me off. And rage boiled in my chest so hot it burned away the fear, because this wasn't just war, this was desecration, and I wasn't about to let them put another drop of death into the water my father taught me. To fish in, the first man never even saw it coming. One squeeze of the trigger and the night split open with thunder, his rifle clattering to the dirt as he went down, and the rest scattered, shouting into radios, firing blind into the trees. But this was my home, my ground, and I knew every ridge, every hollow, every echo of the shoreline better than they ever could, and with my marine ally covering me from the tree line with sniper precision, their advance turned into chaos. The firefight raged for what felt like hours, tracer rounds slicing the night, the air thick with gunpowder and smoke, until the survivors retreated to their SUVs, dragging bodies behind them, leaving barrels half spilled on the ground, toxic, liquid hissing into the soil, and as their engines roared into the distance, silence settled heavy over the lake. But it wasn't peace. It was a warning. Because if Langston had sent this many men tonight and still failed, the next wave would be bigger, meaner, and more desperate. At dawn, I walked the shoreline, the acrid stink of chemicals mixing with the sweet rot of the poisoned water, and I thought about how far this had spiraled, from petty HOA fines to gunfire in the night, from violation notices to mercenaries. On my land, from a poisoned lake to a war that stretched into boardrooms, political offices, and criminal networks. And I realized this fight was no longer about one man's revenge. It had become a battle for the soul of the land itself. A battle between greed and legacy, arrogance and endurance, corruption and truth. I spent that morning hauling the spilled barrels out of the soil, recording everything, sending it straight to the journalists already circling like hawks around Langston's empire, and the images of mercenaries in tactical gear with corporate. Lagos, still taped to their poison containers, lit the fuse on a media firestorm that even Langston couldn't buy his way out of. But exposure didn't stop him. It enraged him. Within days, the county sheriff received orders from higher up to detain me for questioning, a thinly veiled attempt to get me out of the way. But when they came to my property, they didn't find me. I was already gone, deep into the woods, with my allies, moving like ghosts, turning my fight into something Langston couldn't control. A guerrilla war waged on my terms, with every move designed to bleed him of money, influence, and power. We hit his supply chains, leaked his secret contracts, sabotaged the construction crews he tried to sneak into other lakeside properties, and each strike weakened him, not just in profit but in reputation, until the mighty developer was no longer seen as untouchable but as vulnerable, hunted, cornered. Yet with every victory came escalation, and I knew the day was coming when Langston himself would be forced to step out of the shadows, when this war would no longer be fought by pawns and enforcers, but by king against defiant subject. And when that day came, I would be ready, standing at the poisoned lake that started it all, waiting to settle the score once and for all.